there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's a Friday afternoon in March 2015 in the New Zealand city of Invercargill, and Fiona Lu arrives at her 11-year-old son's school just after 3 p.m. Mike isn't there, but his teachers aren't worried. They saw him just before lunch and he probably caught the bus home after swimming practice in the afternoon, they tell her. Fiona heads home, but Mike doesn't arrive. At 4:30 p.m, she calls the school, worried. Then she calls the police. She's pretty sure she knows what's happened. Her ex-husband, John, who her son adores, has travelled to the school from his home in Queenstown and kidnapped him, she insists. She's terrified he'll take him out of the country. But the police drag their feet. They do issue a border alert, but after that they tell her there's nothing much they can do right now. They'll reassess on Monday. For 2 nights, Fiona doesn't sleep. By the time police take the case seriously on the Monday, John and Mike are well and truly on the run. Police say they died in a murder-suicide, but Fiona doesn't accept that. She is confident her son Mike and his stepdad John are very much still alive. I'm Gemma Barth and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. At 1:44 p.m. on Friday, March 20th, a week after Mike's disappearance, Fiona receives a text message from him.
Do you know why this has happened? First, you do not care what I say. You only listen to Peter cow shit. Second, you lie and you should have agreed about the contract that was going 50-50. 3, you have caused this with Peter and you know it. P.S. You do not deserve to be my mum. And you certainly don't deserve my love from Mike.
At 1:45 p.m, another text comes through. This time from John.
Thanks, my love, for being my wife, my partner and my best friend. You are very good at lying and deceiving. You have destroyed our family, my life and Mike's. Happy for what you have done? Me and Mike are leaving now on the Midnight Express. 3 minutes for departure. Bye, my love, and thanks for everything. JB and MB.
It's the last time Fiona ever hears from either of them. Their car is found 9 days later at the bottom of sheer cliffs about an hour's drive from Invercargill. But their bodies are nowhere to be found. Michael Wright, co-host of the Lost Boy podcast series with fellow journalist Shannon Redstall, explores the 2 theories in this case. The first is that Mike and John died in March 2015. The other is that they're very much still alive and living overseas. Michael joins us now. Mike, how did John Beckenridge come into the lives of Mike and his mum Fiona, and what were the dynamics of their family unit?
John Beckenridge was a peripatetic guy. He was a guy who travelled a lot, worked a lot in different places around the globe. He was a helicopter pilot and he actually met Fiona while he was flying helicopters in Afghanistan. And after they met and struck up a relationship, he would take time off in China, in the northeastern province, sort of north of Shanghai where she lived, and that's where he met her son, Mike, who would have been a preschooler at that point. And about this time, John had been living in Australia but had bought some land in New Zealand, down in Queenstown in the South Island. And so it happened over about a year. They moved to New Zealand, built a house, moved in and formed this kind of unlikely nuclear family.
I want to touch a little bit more on his job because it does become a bit more relevant down the track, but he was a helicopter pilot.
Yeah.
It's a pretty dangerous profession.
Yes, in Afghanistan, he was flying like roading crews to patch up highways in the country because highways are collateral damage in war, it turns out. When you blow up a highway, that's a problem. Someone needs to fix it. And he got the job he had because the previous person working there had been shot down and killed.
Wow.
So he was doing stuff. Yeah, it was not just, flying a helicopter from A to B with all the usual helicopter risks. He was an interesting guy. He was a capable guy doing abnormal work. And yeah, like you say, that came up when he and Mike disappeared as to how he might have used his particular sets of skills, if you can call them that, to maybe make them vanish.
John and Mike, they became very close over the years. Can you tell us about the relationship that they formed?
Yeah, so John and Fiona married, and that made John Mike's stepfather. And it took a wee while for them to warm to each other, I think. But John was very keen on being a hands-on dad to Mike. He would buy him toys. He would play video games, computer games with him. He wanted him to do like Kiwi boy stuff, you know. And this was a kid who didn't speak English when he met him. He was 5 or 6 years old, I think, when they moved to New Zealand. And it took over 3 or 4 years, they became really, really close. In this time, Fiona was away a lot. They lived in Queenstown, which is near the bottom of the South Island. And Fiona was studying a hairdressing course in a nearby city, a couple of hours drive away. So she was away for quite a lot. So John and Mike were spending a lot of time together and getting very close. And when John and Fiona's marriage faltered, that became a big issue. The first episode of the podcast is called He's My Son Too, because Mike's custody, as we know from The Lost Boy, the entire pod, the entire story, was at the heart of all of this.
Can you expand a bit more on John and Fiona's relationship and how it did end up breaking down?
Yeah, so like I said, Fiona was away from home a bit, studying, doing a hairdressing course. She was, I think, sort of Monday, Thursday away, back weekends at home. And whilst doing this, she met someone else, kind of, that old chestnut.
Yeah.
This guy was a farmer who lived near Invercargill, the city right at the bottom of the South Island in New Zealand. Shit of a place, which I'm allowed to say because I'm from a different part of Southland. Invercargill sucks. Sorry, Invercargill. Mick Jagger once called it the arsehole of the world when the Rolling Stones found themselves touring there back in the 60s. Yeah. So she met this farmer and they struck up a relationship, and that was the end of John and Fiona's marriage, more or less. When she left, she wanted to take her son with her. And as I've mentioned, John had said, no, he's my son too. This is his home. We've built this home. His house was very important to him. His house was his castle. He was that kind of guy. He'd built this life with his wife and his son, and Mike was John's son in his eyes. So Mike stayed with John when Fiona left, and she moved to Invercargill to start a relationship with a farmer. That lasted for several months, 18 months-ish total. And at the end of that, there was a family court hearing at which Fiona was granted custody of Mike as his birth mother. And so Mike was going to be transferred. He was transferred at the end of the proceeding. He was literally put in a police car and taken to where Fiona and her family were staying in Queenstown for the duration of the hearing and placed in their custody. And as we get into in the pod, Mike was extremely upset about this. He threw a tantrum. He kind of trashed the place that they were living in. And it was just a sign of really how close they'd become, how dependent they'd become, and to some extent the control that John exerted over Mike.
Well, he even called 111, your emergency services, on his own mother, didn't he?
Yes. He accused Fiona's new partner of assaulting him. He rang 111 and said, my mum's been assaulting me. The cop showed up and kind of saw what was happening here. And Mike said to this cop, and the cop was clear when he gave evidence later at a coroner's hearing, this kid was going to cause trouble until he was allowed to go back and stay with John, who he saw as his father. But phoning 111 on your mum and making a fake complaint about assaults is abnormal behaviour.
And Fiona and her new partner, Peter, they were trying their best, weren't they? They were really trying to help Mike settle in.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they started him in a school down in Invercargill. They tried to do exactly the same thing, basically, that John and Fiona and Mike had done. Fiona just simply had a new partner. But given what had happened between John and Mike, this behaviour did not stop. Mike was hard work by all accounts. He was withdrawn or sullen or sometimes outright abusive. He would just tell Peter to fuck off. He called him him and John had a nickname for him. They called him Peter Cowshit.
How is John reacting to all of this? Obviously, we've seen that Mike is quite aggressive, quite upset. What about John?
So John, as far as the authorities knew, was more or less abiding by what was in place, and that he wasn't to have any contact with Mike that wasn't otherwise prearranged or organised. He sent Mike one text message, which we mentioned in the podcast, sort of saying, "Be good, son. Be a good boy. Well, this will all sort itself out." Nothing too sinister, just what scans as, a quite supportive message from an ex-stepfather at that point. It turned out that their disappearance in 2015, John and Mike's, was based on quite a bit of covert communication between the two. Mike had managed to make contact with John first, I think, and then that he was using burner phones and code names, even unnecessary code names, I think, but code names nonetheless, to communicate with each other and organise an escape, for lack of a better word.
Timeline-wise, Mike moves in with his mum and Peter, February 2015, and it's only about a month or so later that he goes missing. It's quite a tight turnaround. Can you tell us about the day before Mike and John disappear? Was there anything unusual that Fiona noticed in her son that day?
Yeah, so like I said, Mike had been quite sullen, withdrawn, kind of hostile to Fiona and Peter, her new partner. And on this night, this is the last night, Fiona, who didn't appear at the coroner's hearing, which this podcast is based on, but did give a statement, had said then that Mike seemed on edge, kind of a nervous, like play acting almost. It's hard to tell in hindsight, but she felt like in hindsight he was trying to hide something. Like it was just different. His behaviour was off, like he knew something was coming. We now know that he did know something was coming. They, of course, were going to go missing the next day. But, yeah, it was kind of ominous the way his behaviour had changed, like he knew it was coming, and his mother, in hindsight, could tell that's what it was.
So the next day, it's a Friday, March 13th. Mike goes to school. Can you explain the iPad incident? Because that basically kind of starts everything off.
Yeah, so Mike had an iPad, and that was how he first was able to communicate with John. Police believe they never got access to the iPad after the fact. And on this day, the 13th, he took it to school. And Fiona and Peter subsequently realised he'd done this late morning and called the school and said, "Look, Mike's not supposed to have his iPad." They were worried he might contact John or John might try and contact him. He wasn't allowed to have that kind of unauthorised use of it. So Peter, Fiona's partner, goes down to the school to collect the iPad. Mike's in music class, I think, at this time, and he goes into the reception area. Mike is arranged to have come from his class and give him the iPad. And this was gone over in a lot of detail at the coroner's hearing because there was CCTV footage at the school, and it was the last CCTV footage they have of Mike, so it was studied quite closely. And Mike's behaviour was just a little bit strange. It took him a while. It took him longer than it should to have got from his classroom to the front of the school, wherever Peter was, to just hand over. It's a pretty straightforward thing. Here's my iPad out of my bag. I'll go back to class. He kind of went back and forward. They could see him on cameras, pausing and stopping. What's he doing there? But the bottom line, there was nothing definitive on there. He wasn't like caught furiously sending one last message and then putting it in his bag and running away. It was just a bit strange, but it kind of set in motion 2 or 3 hours worth of miscommunication, suspicions about behaviour that culminated in everyone realising that Mike and John had gone.
Because as you say, this was kind of around lunchtime, and then Fiona comes to pick up Mike in the afternoon after 3 o'clock when school finishes, and he's not there. What do we know about his movements between music class and the afternoon, or what do they think might have happened?
Yeah, so there's an unfortunate communication breakdown in here, and no one is quite sure exactly what happened between lunchtime and the end of school. There's about a 2-hour window when it's pretty hazy. It's likely, I think, that somewhere at the start of that window, John takes Mike. Because what happened in that afternoon was Mike's class that he was in was going swimming off-site. So they had to get into a bus, go to the pool, come back. There was a relieving teacher involved in this process. So the taking of the role wasn't as rigorous as it might otherwise have been. When Mike wasn't there for pickup at the end of school, a teacher, he must have just got off the swimming bus and got on the school bus to go home, Fiona. So there's no need, he must be at home. So it took until about 3:30, 4 o'clock when Mike didn't show up at home, when Fiona was like, well, hang on, where is he? And went back to school and kind of raised the alarm. And then the balloon went up, sort of, because Fiona was worried about what might have happened. But as we get into in the podcast, it took a couple of days for a police investigation or a search, an APB to go out and things to really start happening to try and find these guys, because it was not treated with urgency straight away.
Why wasn't it treated with urgency? It's an 11-year-old boy.
You'd have to ask the police, honestly. It's easy now to say, why did they not immediately span out across Southland and just try and find anything to track these guys down? But it was never really thought, because John and Mike were close, it was never really a consideration that Mike might be in danger. He might be physically in danger, whatever John might do to him, which is the first measure for how quickly and urgently and comprehensively police will respond to a missing child. If somebody's abducted by somebody that they know has an intent of harming them, of course police would go all out to find that person. But this was, I suspect, a domestic issue. That was how it was seen. Look, this is a fight between an ex and the kid's mum. He's probably taken him. Maybe they're going fishing for the weekend. Maybe he just wants to see him. They're not going to vanish off the face of the earth. That was not the thinking. They weren't disregarding salient information at that point that might have been telling them, you need to go and find these guys.
Was it also disregarded a little bit because obviously weekends, there's not as many people on deck? They kind of were like, let's pick it up on Monday kind of thing.
It's hard to say. Police never said anything like that. Fiona and Peter kind of lamented as much, thinking it's a Friday afternoon. The investigation really kind of picks up on a Monday. Other things happen. Some people come to police and give them more information about what's going on in this family. We can't get into all of that. There are suppressions around this case. The family court was involved, but more information comes to the police that gives them good reason to escalate their actions in trying to find these guys. I think it was the Monday when police realised they had enough information in front of them to be like, okay, this is actually a serious problem. One, we haven't heard from them in 2 days. No one's seen them. Where are they?
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with New Zealand-based journalist and co-host of the Lost Boy podcast, Michael Wright. Up next, what do the police find when their search for Mike and John begins? So the police get calls about 2 different campsites. Let's start with the first one. A farmer calls them and tells them about a sighting. Can you tell us about what they found?
Yeah, so the part of the police APB was these 2 guys. Here are their photos. Here is their vehicle. John's vehicle. It's a Volkswagen Touareg. And a farmer in rural Southland, and I should stress this is a really kind of remote part of an already rural area, an already rural part of New Zealand. We're right at the bottom of the South Island. We're in farmland. It's kind of off the main highway. It's not somewhere people go unless you live there or have a good reason to go. So vehicles that police are trying to find are conspicuous if somebody recognises one. And a farmer did near a town called Wyndham, and called police and said, look, I saw this blue Volkswagen Touareg, or what looked like it, on the edge of my property or just over the edge of my property yesterday, day before. So police track this down. The car is gone, but they do find the remnants of what looks like a campsite, a pretty rough campsite, 2 people sleeping rough. Perhaps there's a tent, but there's some very basic, toothpaste, discarded tea bags, a bandage, those kind of things left at this site. There's a little bit of lettuce that's still green, so they know it's a fresh site. And it's pretty clear, it's not 100%, but it looks very likely that this is John and Mike on the run, sleeping rough, back of a farmer's paddock sort of thing.
And then they get word of a second campsite. Timeline-wise, we're talking about Thursday the 19th. So it's, a week later almost. What did they find at that site?
The second site was reported to them by someone who'd been at it. This is an actual campsite, like a government-run, state type campsite, a proper thing. And someone went into a police station and said, look, I think I saw these guys yesterday, day before at this site, at a place called Haldane Bay, which is right on the south coast. So police go there and they find their site. They find the tent and everything in it, and that's it. That this is where they are. We haven't found them, but we've kind of found them. So they stake it out and wait for these guys to come back. The blue Torres isn't there, but the campsite is. And they don't come back. After, I think the police wait overnight, hidden in the bushes around the site, waiting for them to come back. And then they go, okay, let's go and search this thing, turn the campsite over and see what we can find. And they find all the usual things, gas cookers, sleeping bags, a tent, all the things you would do, pretty basic, but, actual camping. But there's no sign of John or Mike.
Meanwhile, while they've got this stakeout happening, police are obviously digging into John's life a bit more. And they're finding a few things of note. He's kind of spoken to his lawyer. He's gotten rid of some possessions. What else was he kind of doing behind the scenes?
Yeah, so John, it's about a 3-week period from the family court case to the disappearance. And in that time, John, as you say, has spoken to a lawyer. He was inquiring about possibly appealing that decision. He had, as you say, given some things away, possessions to other people, like a computer or some camping gear or weather jackets, that sort of thing, material possession type stuff. And he'd also been, as he had for some months, borrowing money off friends. A few hundred here, a few thousand here, not like tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars or something, but, not nothing. So on the one hand, there's ways you can read into it. Well, maybe he was a guy who looked like he was getting his affairs in order before he was going to go and do something drastic. Or he was a guy who was just sort of desperate and devolving a little and really wanting to get his son or his stepson back and trying to do everything he could. But as police looked into him and his home in Queenstown and all of these things around him, it became clear that John was he'd planned something. He had been working at this for a while, and they realised the extent of their communication or likely communication. They found a memory stick with some photos on it that had annotated notes on it of Mike's school. Planned, like Google Map Street View type stuff that these two had obviously been working with each other on, sending to each other to work out where he was going to drop a burner phone, where the pickup spot was going to be, that sort of thing. So police realise a lot of planning has gone into this escape. And John is not coping well with the outcome of the family court ruling, put it that way.
What about correspondence-wise? During this time that we know that they're on the run, especially when they've found this second campsite, were John and Mike contacting anyone in their lives via text or email or anything?
So for the most part, no. Police later sort of pieced together a couple of things. There were the 2 sightings we talked about. They were caught on a CCTV camera at a petrol station in a little town close to this area called Tokanui. But other than that, it was pretty much radio silence until the next Friday, the 20th. And on that day, so that's the day after police have gone and staked out and turned over that campsite, several of John's friends get messages, goodbye messages, more or less, from John. Fiona gets a goodbye message from John and one from Mike. That is just brutal. There's no other way to put it. You are not my mother anymore. You never, just really heavy stuff. But all of these friends get these messages, and because police have been doing their jobs and speaking to these friends in the meantime, they call the investigators back and say, I've just got a text from John and it doesn't bode well from what he's saying here. So all of these people sort of realise, okay, something might be happening here. All of these people got these messages within 5-10 minutes of each other. This is on the afternoon of the 20th. And police really up the ante on that day. They are out in force, full lights, sirens, marked cars, presence in the area. Helicopter. They pulled a helicopter off a cannabis search to get up in the air and see what they could find. And all of this culminates on Friday afternoon in them finding what looks like tyre tracks in a paddock right on the coast that end at the edge of a very tall cliff. And it takes them a while because this, like I say, is a remote, isolated, pretty rugged part of New Zealand. But after a day or two, they realise John's Torres is in the water at the bottom of these cliffs.
And they find it, don't they?
Yeah, it takes a couple of days. The divers can't get in the water. They have to have, I think they had to put the camera on a rope from the chopper in the first instance to even get it in the water and see, okay, yes, it's in the water. But they couldn't get in. It took them the best part of a couple of days to get down there, or a week maybe to get down there and find the car and establish no one was in it. And then a couple of months to be able to get it out of the water, by which point it is, a husk basically.
Because to explain, the water in that area as well is very rough, isn't it?
Yeah. So Strait is the water we're talking. It's a strait between the bottom of the South Island and Stewart Island. It's quite shallow, a lot of sharks, but it's quite shallow, so it's quite rough. Doesn't take much for a big swell to build up in there. And these are 80-metre cliffs on this part of the coast. It's almost the very southernmost tip of the South Island. So this car's gone down a long way into heavy seas. It's sort of surrounded on three sides by these cliffs, so the water is just sloshing in and out. The police divers, as they said later, was like, you can be getting thrown one way and then thrown the other way. It's like being in a washing machine, just being in this water. You've got to wait for ideal conditions to do something like winch a car wreck out of the water there. So, yeah, it's very, very rugged. Yeah.
Would it be unusual in sea like that and after that many days for there to not be any sign of bodies in the car? Big question.
On the question that right at the heart of this case, which is what happened to John and Mike. They weren't in the car when police found them. The seatbelts were done up, but they weren't restrained by them. And given the state of the sea, of course, why would a body last in a car for so long? Well, you could totally see how that would happen. But a lot of evidence was heard about the tyre tracks at the top and the seatbelts at the bottom in the car, and what that pointed to in terms of John and Mike being in the car or not. Because if they go over the edge, they die. It's as simple as that. It's a big cliff. But given John's past and what police knew about him and what they knew about the relationship between John and Mike, the idea that they might have staged all of this was very much a possibility, and that was looked into a lot as well. So there was a lot of police work done. What are these tyre tracks like? How fast were they going? Could someone have not been in the car? Could this have been staged? The seatbelts, were they ever restraining someone? Could someone have been in them and washed away, or were they done up to make it look like someone had been washed away? All these sorts of things became the number one priority for police.
Like you say, there were these two main theories that they were looking into, and there was a coronial inquest to kind of look at that. I think it's really interesting how you point out that usually a coronial inquest is, a fact-finding mission, but this one became almost like a trial. Like, which of these two scenarios is the most likely?
Yeah, so the podcast, the audio that we use for most of the podcast is from a coronial hearing that was held in Christchurch last year, so like 8 years after the fact. And at that point, the police had arrived at the conclusion that they were most likely dead. So the lawyers involved in the coronial hearing were one sort of neutral party, a counsel assisting, a lawyer for the police, and a private investigator who'd sort of been working on behalf of the family. Not a lawyer, but an ex-cop, an experienced investigator. And yeah, like you say, because police had more or less reached a conclusion, they kind of prosecuted their case, for lack of a better phrase, when it came to it. It was they cross-examined, defence, quote-unquote, witnesses like you would see in a trial. I didn't actually cover the case. My colleague Shannon Redstall, who was the co-producer and presenter of this podcast, she covered the case at the time. And that was sort of based on her insight. Like, she sort of said as much in the pod, like, I felt a little bit uneasy at the extent to which this became as adversarial as it did. It was it's not the first time, lawyers are lawyers and court systems are court systems. These things can sort of revert to type, but it became, dare I say it, sort of unhelpfully adversarial.
You've mentioned the seatbelts, which became a big focus. The other focus that I want to mention before we move on to the family's theory is the brake pedals, because obviously if it was a murder-suicide, they were kind of questioning why you would be braking at the edge of the cliff.
Yeah, so this goes back to the tracks that they found at the top of the cliff. There were 3 sets of tracks. One was irrelevant, police thought. 2 of them more or less went to the edge. One they surmised was a practice run. And then there was the tracks that went all the way to the edge. These are the tracks that the car made as it went over the cliff. And police found that about 10 metres from the edge of the cliff, the tracks showed signs of braking, someone applying the brake pedal, which would mean someone has to be in the car at that point. So using that as sort of one constant, if you like, they then looked at the edge of the cliff where the tracks stopped. The tracks stopped about 3 or 4 metres from the edge. The cliff sort of ran downhill slightly right at the edge, so the car's sort of been airborne. It didn't touch the ground all the way to the edge, if that makes sense. 3 or 4 metres before the edge, the tracks disappear. So police can do a calculation and say, this is how fast this vehicle that weighs this much must have been going, or would have had to have been going, in order to become airborne at that point. If a vehicle's going that fast, could a person have applied the brakes 10 metres from the edge and then got themselves out of the vehicle and not rolled over the edge at that speed? And the police concluded that they couldn't have. They would have needed probably 20 metres to throw themselves out of the vehicle and stay on the cliff. Basically, the momentum was going to carry them over if you jumped out that close, which seemed pretty decisive or conclusive. It's maths. You couldn't be in the vehicle and get yourself safely out of it if you applied the brakes. So that was one of the key elements, the key straws to their case, that John and Mike were dead. They just couldn't have got out of the car that close to the edge, and they had to be in the car that close to the edge.
After the break, we heard one theory about what happened to Mike and John. But what is Fiona, Mike's mother, thinking? And why does she believe they could still be alive? Fiona isn't just hopeful that Mike is alive. She is adamant.
She is.
Can you explain her theory and what she thinks happened?
So, as I said, there were 2 lawyers at the coronial hearing and a private investigator who was working for Fiona and Peter. And his job was more or less to put a defence case, for lack of a better word, at this hearing. And that was based on the fact that they believe adamantly that John and Mike are alive. Fiona believed in the first instance John was hiding money in order to finance such an operation. He was a very skilled guy. He was a helicopter pilot. He was a good sailor. He had some contacts overseas. He was from Sweden initially. And that's another part of the story, his life back in Sweden before he came to the Southern Hemisphere. And basically the kind of guy who could have pulled something like this off, she thought. So with all of those behavioural factors in mind, the family then focused, like police did on the tyre tracks, on the seatbelts in the car. That was the forensic element of the case that they were really interested in. The seatbelts were done up, like I said, and the police divers, when they first got to the car, they said when we opened it, the seatbelts were done up tight, super tight. And when the seatbelt experts that they consulted looked into this, they looked at, these seatbelts haven't recoiled. Turns out, I didn't know this, but seatbelts, if you're in an accident and there is an impact and you've got your seatbelt done up, the seatbelt will go tight to hold you in place, and then it will recoil, basically go loose, so that you're not held in as you were at the point of impact. And these seatbelts hadn't done that. There was no sign of wear on them that pointed to a body being restrained by them while something like a car going over a cliff and having that impact in the ocean happened. So how were they in the car? Who did up the seatbelts? And this was another point of contention, basically. The police ventured a counter theory that maybe they did them up and sat on top of them in order to make it look like all of this. And maybe a simpler explanation is they just did them up to make it look like them, and they weren't in them when the car went over the cliff. So it was definitely not clear from the seatbelts that they were in the car. It was a pretty strong counter to the police and the tyre tracks evidence that they'd put forward, and it really did help and support Fiona and Peter's case in believing they were still alive.
I think perhaps the biggest bit of evidence I heard that supports their theory is the former life you were referring to.
Yeah.
John's former partner, he had 2 sons with another woman called Anne, which is a whole other story. But can you give us a brief overview of what happened there?
Yeah, so John, as I said, he's from Sweden originally. And this was mentioned at the time of their disappearance somewhat, in that John had 1 or 2 aliases, and there were Swedish names. Lund, Lundh, was one of the surnames that he used, in his original surname. But it turned out through this coronial hearing that John had had a former life, a wife and 2 children. And he'd walked out on them in not dissimilar circumstances to what had happened with Mike. He met his wife, who we called Anne, in the podcast. They had everything suppressed. She was Danish, he was Swedish. They met in Greenland. He was flying helicopters in Greenland. Again, not your average place to be a helicopter pilot. That's the kind of guy he was. They had 2 sons, and shortly before the second son was born, John just up and left, and he was gone. And that was that. There was a protracted hearing in Danish court about what John was responsible for, child custody, paying child custody wise. And John acted strangely, maybe even stranger than he did in this case. He would sort of write long letters to the judge accusing the children's mother of all sorts of things, just telling them to drop the kids off and I'll take them, you know how it is, like ridiculous suggestions like that. And it ended with him basically leaving. That's how he ended up in the Southern Hemisphere. He moved to Australia about this time. This is in the 90s. But the way in which he went about all of this, like just kind of dispensing with one life and starting up another one, he's the kind of guy who's done something like this before. So, yeah, it goes to a pattern of behaviour. This is not your average guy who panics, say, and might drive himself and his stepson, to a murder-suicide.
Did Anne, I know that's the name you've given her, but did Anne give any insight into whether she thinks John might be alive?
She did. And that, again, supported Fiona because her position was, I absolutely believe John could be alive. He is the kind of person who could do this because of what we've just said. He's done something similar to me. He's the kind of guy who can do this. He was from a middle-class family in Sweden. John, I think he was the second of 4 kids. And he'd had an older brother who inherited the family business. He sort of fell out with his family, thought he was better. It was a furniture business. And he thought, I'm a better carpenter than my brother. That kind of hubris, I guess, that kind of self-certainty.
Confidence.
Yeah, confidence is a nicer way of putting it. That he was a very driven character, John. He was very certain of what he wanted and what he was going to do, and that he was right about things in his own thoughts. And that played out in his first relationship with Anne and their children. Anne gave a statement, like I say, she couldn't really speak to the fact of the case. She hadn't seen John for years. But her exact quote was something like, I don't believe he's the suicidal type. He lived a good life. He's not the kind of guy to do this. And that helped. That helped Fiona and Peter and their case, quote unquote, to try and argue to the coroner that John and Mike were alive. There was not enough evidence to rule them dead.
Have there been any credible sightings of John and Mike since 2015, since they went missing?
Depends how you define credible. Some people think there have been, and others don't. There were a whole bunch of sightings that came in when police first went to the media and said, have you seen these guys? But the bulk of them were in Southland, and they were on or before the 20th when the car went over the cliff. There were a handful that came in after that. Some of them were overseas, and a few of those were looked into and disregarded or ruled out for whatever reason. But there was one in particular that we get into in the podcast from a New Zealand woman who was on holiday in Bali, a little island just off the coast of Bali, who was adamant she saw John and Mike one day several months after they disappeared. This is June, I think, 2015. And she gave evidence at the hearing. She was the only post-disappearance eyewitness to give any evidence. She gave pretty good descriptions of an older guy. He was wearing a backpack, she said. He had a little bit of a stoop, and a boy, an East Asian boy who was quite big. Mike was quite big for his age, so not that much smaller than John. He was 11 or 12, I think, at that point. Standing out, that there was not a usual pairing you might see on a holiday island that's full of Aussies and Kiwis, taking a winter break. That was one.
I'm interested in Mike's friend.
That's the other one. So it's not a sighting per se, but Mike's friend, who he went to school with in Queenstown, he's the same age, he has name suppression, but he eventually told police that he thought he'd had some contact from Mike over gaming consoles. Mike was a big gamer, played online, multiplayer things, talking to your mates, playing a shoot-'em-up game, that kind of thing. And Mike's friend had said, I was contacted by somebody on one of these platforms using Mike's handle, like a very specific username that was Mike's name. Swaggamer123, I think it was, from memory. And no one would know that. Who would use that handle except Mike? So police looked into this pretty hard. It turned out they couldn't find a server that might have kept something like this. He didn't take a screenshot at the time, Mike's friend, so there was no documentary evidence to help support this. Police concluded ultimately they thought Mike's friend wanted to help. He wanted his friend to be alive and was in good faith telling police what he thought, but that it probably wasn't the case. If it was the case, then that would be a pretty reliable sighting, quote unquote, of Mike. No one else would use a name like that or contact this particular person in any form if it wasn't Mike. So neither of these sightings were concrete, but I guess both sides, as we've established, there were sides, both sides could use them to their own ends and say, look, this does or does not point to Mike and John being alive.
So what did the coroner find after hearing all of this?
We don't know. The hearing proper finished last year, but there is about one more day's worth of evidence to hear. That's going to involve some peer review of some of the specialist reports at the scene where the car went over the cliff. And after that, the coroner will have a decision to make. In New Zealand, as I think with Australia, the threshold is balance of probabilities. It's not a beyond reasonable doubt test. But, the question he has to consider is, are they more likely alive or dead? And that's to come.
I'm assuming that Fiona, either way, is going to be sticking to her guns because Mike, if he is alive, would be about 20 now in 2024.
Yeah.
Is she hopeful that one day, somewhere down the track, he'll eventually reach out, or what's she hoping for?
Fiona mostly wants Mike to be happy, I think. There was this quite touching moment at the end of her statement where she said, and her partner Peter said as much when he gave evidence, where they kind of talked about what would we do if one day they turned up or we found out they were alive, or something like that. And Peter kind of thought out loud, look, maybe if we knew they were alive and happy, we'd leave them where they are. It's not like we want them back, like it's a possession that we've lost. We just want them to be alive and well. That's all. So, yeah, I agree. She is sticking to her guns. I mean, nothing in lieu of bodies, which is not possible really at this point, would change her mind, I don't think. But she's not wishing her... I mean, I think she would love her son to come back.
Of course.
But she's not wishing for that the most. She wants him to be alive and well.
Thanks to Mike for helping us tell this story. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, and Tali Blackman, with audio design by Scott Stronach. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.